So I owe Erpic, I think, first of all, thanks, and secondly, a quasi-apology, but thanks for inviting me, because it's always lovely to come to Cyprus and see dear friends here. The quasi-apology, because my paper has almost nothing to do with the real subject of the conference, and certainly nothing to do with the Crescent crisis. I suppose, as a historian, 19th and 20th century, you think, well, what would non-crisis be? Crises are always with us, so one becomes a little bit, I suppose, sceptical in so many ways about thoughts of crisis. So let me begin with two quotations in this idiosyncratic paper. The first is a presentation. The first, well, I said it would be idiosyncratic, is from Benito Mussolini, who gave a speech in Milan in November 1936. And he said that for the British, the Mediterranean was only via. For Italy, it was vita. It was life itself. Of course, the implication being, therefore, Italy should have priority over the settlement of issues in the Central and elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Anthony Eden, at that time, the politician in London, mostly concerned with Mediterranean issues and with sustaining a British presence in the Mediterranean, was quick to intervene and say, no, for the British, the Mediterranean is perhaps less than vita, but it's much more than via. And it's that ambiguity of the British in the Mediterranean, how important it is for them, their stake in it, and the price they should pay for being there, which is implicit in my paper, because I suppose, digressing, that it's those very ambiguities, complexities, obfuscations, the word we had earlier, I might return to later on, which entered into the Anglo-Cypriot relationship, as it did in every relationship that the British had in the region. And if we talk about the damage done, the complexities and antagonisms within the Anglo-Cypriot relationship, they're mirrored in exactly the same qualities in the Anglo-Egyptian, the Anglo-Maltese, the Anglo-whatever you like, within the Mediterranean world. The second quotation comes from a historian, E.H. Carr, so well-known to undergraduates of my generation as a historian of the Soviet Union, but he wrote a book in 1937 on the British and the Mediterranean. And he said, for Great Britain, the Mediterranean problem is, in its final analysis, a problem of the way in, the way through, and the way out. If you consider the step by which Great Britain became a Mediterranean power, you will find that the policy has always been dominated by the question of entrances and exits. Now, because he was talking in the afterblast of the Abyssinian crisis, essentially, strategically, a Mediterranean crisis, despite the fact that Abyssinia is down there somewhere. But it was a Mediterranean crisis. And the histories of most countries in the Mediterranean, for that period, the subject of Abyssinia looms large. There's at least one book, for example, on Greece and the Abyssinian crisis. In the historiography of Cyprus, where you barely hear mention of the word Abyssinia. And it's this relative introspectiveness, the hermetically sealed character, strategically speaking, in pan-Mediterranean terms, which is part of what I will be talking about. And I suppose the ambivalence of Cyprus in British strategic assessments is the period I'm talking about anyway, technologically speaking, but it was not on the way in, on the way through, or on the way out, of anywhere very precisely. In other words, Cyprus was never an opening, an aperture, in an efficient sense, in the same way as Gibraltar, in the same way as the Straits of Constantinople, as Alexandria and Suez. Nor, of course, did it have the centrally commanding position of Malta. Cyprus I should not propose to consider a senior Admiralty planner very archly put it in 1898, when considering where the British Mediterranean fleet should be based at the outbreak of any war, as it has no harbours and no strategic value. And that dismissiveness is endemic in many British strategic assessments, and to some extent enters now increasingly into some of the literature. I noticed that a recent book by Anglo, for example, has its subtitle, The Inconsequential Possession, reflecting that. Because the problem is that strategic value is always so nebulous, isn't it? It's what anybody wants to make it at any particular time. Under specific and usually wildly changing circumstances, it means everything, it means nothing. It means one thing in 1 minute, something completely different the next. I suppose a classic instance in some ways of how this changes is Gibraltar. The military significance of which is normally taken as an absolute given, isn't it? I mean, it's even entered the kind of musical lexicon. I mean, Mozart, I was amazed to learn, actually wrote an ode to Gibraltar and the defenders of Gibraltar in the 1780s. And of course, Impregnable, as safe as a rock, has continued. Ella Fitzgerald had a lyric on the matter in the 1940s, presumably because it was Eisenhower's first land headquarters, European and Allied, in Europe. But in fact, there's also a whole literature on the defects of Gibraltar as a base from the late 18th century. Its lack of water, its prevalence of disease, its vulnerability to land attack. And indeed, from the 1860s, 70s, it really was indefensible to a land attack from Spain, were Spain ever to take that particular course of action, because big artillery meant that it was indefensible. And a very prestigious soldier, various governors of Gibraltar, of course, were soldiers. When he was made governor in 1938, he went for some briefings to Whitehall, and he said afterwards in his diary, the place was only a garage. I dread to think what the Gibraltarians would say if they knew. And many a governor in Nicosia, surely, must have dreaded what the Cypriots would say if they had known, if they had read minutes in different defence departments, the Admiralty, the War Office, about the exiguous military value of the island of Cyprus. But even so, after September 1939, Gibraltar, as only a garage, was absolutely vital, above all in relation, of course, to the Allied invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, in November 1942. So the point is that hard and fast strategic assessments at any one time, more often than not, can be completely disproved by subsequent events. So putting a precise value on them can be very, very difficult. So why did the British keep Cyprus from 1878 through to 1960? Why didn't they give it up after 1882, when, as we heard, the British occupied Alexandria? Well, of course, practical uses should not be underestimated. The Troodos Mountains offered a cool climate and a sanatorium for recovering personnel. And not least important, of course, was transport, and in particular, the mules of the island, which were used in campaigns in Egypt, in Greece, in Palestine. This may seem like taking coals to Newcastle. Egypt had a few mules of its own, after all. But without the mule farms around Famagusta, it's quite conceivable that the advance of Allenby's armies on Jerusalem in 1917, 1918 would have been even further delayed than they were. Mules were crucial to the logistics of unmotorised fighting. No mules, no manoeuvre, an experienced French general pointed out during the Italian campaign in 1944, a campaign in which many Cypriots, of course, of the Cyprus regiment also fought. But over and above the kind of prosaic elements like carobs, mules, the British motivation in possessing Cyprus, above all, was to stop other people having it and to develop it at some future point, if it ever seemed worthwhile to do it. There were two junctures where it looked as if this might be happening. One was in 1937 and the other in 1953, 1954. Both of these occasions were not on the merits of the island itself, but rather because of political uncertainty in Egypt. And again, assessments of water are always in relation, of course, to other places, and above all, in relation to Egypt itself. Now, did Cypriots want to be developed? Did they resent not being developed by British money and technology in the colonial period, dockyards and all, as in the case of Malta? Henry Friendlow, a letter-based historian, who I think has been to Urquhart meetings before, suggests that they did in the 1930s. There was this sense of being left apart from economic development because of British military spending, though perhaps on his part that reflects a specifically Maltese discourse. But meanwhile, pure hypotheticals and negatives about possible future development that never actually occurred do not make a brilliant basis for any relationship. So what went wrong in the Anglo-Cypriot interaction? Well, a vacuum, an absence of clear direction or purpose, which is, I think, on the whole, very much to the fore in any treatment of the British presence in the island. They don't really know what to do with it. They don't really know why they're there or what the purpose is. So what I'm going to be talking about here is Cyprus and British in Cyprus in a kind of eclectic pan-Mediterranean perspective. It emerges from the book I'm doing on the British in the Mediterranean since the 1800s, so a rather vast sort of overview. And I think it's very helpful at times anyway to see how Cyprus related to other places in the region and the British estimation of them. But if there was one, if I had to, at the outset, identify one key question about the British in the Mediterranean over this long period through to circa 1960, it's really this. Were they staying? Were they really going to stay, having arrived in circa 1798 with the Battle of the Nile? Or would they go in the end? Were they mere visitors, like the Americans or the Danes, as a naval correspondent of the Times, W.L. Clowes, the naval historian, put it in the 1890s? Or had they even by then become perhaps in some sense inhabitants of the area, genuine players in the politics and society of the region? And it's this theme of uncertainty and also the sort of question marks about possible evacuation, possible abandonment, which is crucial, it seems to me, to virtually all British Mediterranean relationships and the uncertainties that went with them and the lack of trust also which went with them. Now, a columnist in the Financial Times wrote a piece this summer, again, an idiosyncratic bit of background, wrote a column this summer about how curiously inefficient trans-Mediterranean travel is. He wanted, I think, to go from Palma to Nice and on to Beirut, and he found he couldn't quite do it in the way he wanted to. And of course, there's nothing new in this. Elizabeth Munro, who was a great commentator on Mediterranean politics in the 1930s, wrote a book called The Mediterranean in Politics in 1937. In that book, she says how she wanted to go from Algeria to Egypt, but taking Tunis on the way. Went into a travel agent, was told that this was a crazy idea, that she couldn't possibly get such a ticket made under her name. And of course, this is simply an anecdotal way of highlighting the unintegrated nature of the Mediterranean itself. Ferdinand Braudel, the famous French historian of the Mediterranean, was very careful to say early on in his book that he wrote about the Mediterranean world, not the Mediterranean region, because it wasn't a region, in a clear, clinical, and above all perhaps strategic sense. And another Maltese historian, Dominic Fenet, defines this in strategic terms more recently by writing, most Mediterranean countries define their interests in ways that are tangential to or lead away from the Mediterranean rather than across it. He concludes that the regionality of the Mediterranean is recognized more by external actors with alleged vital interests than by the indigenous states. In itself, this follows directly from the last 19th century, where Mediterranean regionality was largely brought about by the British-Russian-French contest for hegemony. And so the Mediterranean as a concept, in strategic and military terms, and perhaps also in diplomatic terms, is highly precarious. And surely, if I digress very briefly, as I have done in preparation, the same can be said about the Middle East. I mean, what a very curious term. And we say it so lightly, don't we, and so often. But, I mean, it was an armchair invention of British strategists circa 1912, 1913, certainly in the early years of the Great War. And of course, very much so in the post-1945 context. But it seems to be most unlikely that the term is likely to survive the next 20 years, because from a Chinese perspective, from an Indian perspective, in a multipolar world as we are certainly now going to be living in, what does this term actually convey to anybody? We may well end up rather with an older set of terms, such as Near East or Levant, as being equally usable, though they too, of course, carry their cultural baggage. So I'm rather, quizzical about the terminology of the Middle East, just as one is, again, to take issue with Diakliakos, with the issue of the West. I wonder to a younger generation today, age less than 25, what do these terms mean? And certainly what does the term the West mean? Do they identify with the West or with values of the West? I don't think so. Now, to come back to my history, it seems to me that insofar with all this sort of difficulty pinning down Mediterranean concepts, that if there was a classic Mediterranean institution from the 1840s through to the 1940s, the British Mediterranean fleet was it. I mean, the one pan-Mediterranean institution was a fleet. Of course, French commercial shipping lines out of Marseille, or the Austria-Lloyd line out of Trieste, played something of this role, but they were essentially commercial. When monarchs arrived in their new states or escaped from them, the Greek king arriving in 1839 and leaving in 1862, when troublemakers were exiled, in inverted commas, when refugees were picked up, it was usually in British warships. States were created by the acts and omissions of the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. Well, of course, we all know about Navarino and Admiral Codrington and this emergence of an independent Greece. But equally, Italy would not have emerged in 1860 had his latter-day successor, Admiral Parker, intervened to stop Garibaldi getting from Genoa to Sicily in the first place, and then to Naples thereafter. Now, Cyprus, however, of course, had an essentially erratic and subsidiary relationship to the British fleet. And to that extent, of course, it underpins its peripherality and its marginality in pan-Mediterranean terms in that period. Again, compare that to Malta. Of course, British maritime supremacy was axiomatic, as I've already said, in Greek and Italian political discourse over a long period. That maritime power both established new states but set the limits within which they operated. Clearly, that's relevant in the Cypriot case when Venizelos in 1919, again in 1931, effectively blocked off any movement at an international level to assisting Cypriot aspirations to independence. British naval power in the Mediterranean seems on the ropes in June 1940, but some kind of apparent dominance was reasserted by September 1943 when the Italian fleet, the Italian foreign minister, surrendered Prime Minister on board a British warship off Grand Harbour, Valletta. It's worth recalling on that occasion, the Greek Navy was allotted a place in the receiving line of ships for the Italian fleet in Valletta, something that probably wouldn't have happened a year later following the mutinies of the Greek troops in Egypt. But by 1950s, roughly by 1950, the days of British domination in the Mediterranean had, of course, seemingly passed, and the baton passed on to the American Sixth Fleet. And the effects on Greek Cypriot calculations of that, some Greek Cypriot calculations, we'll come back to. But the American Navy thereafter could never play the regional or political role of its British equivalent, usually reduced in a crisis to brooding off some bit of the Lebanese or Syrian coast to no great effect, as it did during the Lebanese crisis, of where is it now, 2 years ago. Yet British mastery, supremacy, strength, as we're talking about it, was often really rather deceptive, and to the British appeared what to other people might seem very immutable, seemed extremely tenuous to the British themselves. In 1796, the British had abandoned the Mediterranean completely. Nelson fought his way back in, but the spectre of that experience never went away. And there were periods thereafter of an anti-Mediterranean reaction, a desire to withdraw altogether from Mediterranean strategic and military engagements. That feeling in 1815, again in the 1890s, again in the years before 1914, again after 1935, and in 1940 Churchill had to fend off his service advisors, who were all keen to clear out of the Mediterranean immediately. So the Mediterranean and assets in the Mediterranean were often seen as a millstone, best cast off until victory or security could be won in other directions. And the consequences for any such abandonment were vital to many local populations, and again enters into that lack of trust and that query about how reliable the British can be as a partner, as a ruler. Now, it's often argued that a Greek Cypriot, even a Greek Cypriot intelligentsia, before circa 1945, certainly before 1939, had very little engagement with the broader flux of international and regional affairs, over and above its Hellenic attachments. And one wonders about this because one's security depended absolutely vitally on those regional developments. And indeed, in the mid-1930s, the British began checking off which bits of the Mediterranean they might need to keep, which bits might be dispensable. The Maltese certainly got very worried whenever the fleet went to Alexandria, which it did on 4 occasions, because they feared it might not come back. An Israeli historian notes how Palestinian Jews carefully monitored the nuances of British strategic debates because they knew their future hinged on the outcome. Egyptians went from wanting to get the British troops out to having as many possible as they could. More should come in. Maltese, Zionists, Egyptians all knew that predators were on the prowl in the Mediterranean in the 1930s and were keen to secure the protection of the British. Did Cypriots feel none of these things, and if not, why? Few could be under any illusion that Greece might provide an alternative. So I think one wants to have a wider regional appreciation, like earlier periods, of views of the wider world, and not just obviously of the Hellenic world. I mean, nowhere by the end of the 1930s, for example, was more dispensable than Cyprus. The Navy planned to have, certainly didn't plan to concentrate anywhere near it because the Dodecanese was too near, with its Italian airfields. It was left, in effect, to be picked up by any enemy prepared to divert resources in a war position because its garrison was simply so small, slightly increased, I believe, in July 1931, reduced again after the Syrian business was over in the middle of that year, later that summer. After June 1940, Mussolini encouraged Hitler to take Cyprus, and occasionally Mussolini encouraged Hitler to take Cyprus. But neither did so. So, against this background, perhaps, it's easier to understand that very aspiration of quality, that very qualified character of quality in this earlier period of Greek Cypriot desires for enesis. They knew, at the level of intelligentsia, that any change of status of the island was more likely to be from one overlord to another, rather than the consummation of Hellenic ideals. Now let me come to Malta again and to a Malta-Cyprus comparison because they seem very instructive. Of course, in a Maltese case, the British presence went back a lot longer, to 1800, not just to 1878, and it was deeper both strategically and culturally. There were similarities between the Cypriot and the Maltese colonial experience. The Maltese had their constitution suspended once, of course, in 1931. The Maltese had theirs suspended on multiple occasions, another way of saying they kept losing it and getting it back again. And of course, again, in terms of a broader setting, I think, particularly from the 1920s onwards, this sense of a flawed constitutionalism within the British Mediterranean world is absolutely vital. And wherever you look, there are attempts to set up constitutions, and inevitably, invariably, they fail. Indeed, in Palestine, in the end, the British don't get a constitution at all, though they deeply want one. In Malta, I've already said that they are suspended in 1931, again in 1933. In Egypt, of course, in 1936, the constitution is suspended. So one can see that part of the Cypriot experience, again, as being mimicked elsewhere. Of course, what set Malta apart was the war experience. I mean, after June 1940, and especially after January 1931, the Maltese and the British were bombed and near starved together on the island. There were more explosives dropped on Malta than either London or Coventry at the heart of their blitzes. And of course that was a kind of bonding experience, of which the Jules Cross, the award of the Jules Cross, was simply one emblem. This didn't mean that the British and the Maltese loved each other, but it did mean there was a certain mutual admiration for mutual survivability under very adverse conditions. It also helps to explain, of course, I suppose, why Malta got a spanking new constitution in 1947, whereas Cyprus, in the end, for all sorts of reasons, did not. There were many bumps ahead in the Anglo-Maltese relationship. There was indeed a little emergency in 1958 and post-colonial difficulties. But nevertheless, in Valletta today, in the evening, you can have your dinner in the Prince of Wales Band Club and pop around the corner and have a drink in the Anglo-Maltese Union. So there's a very curious Anglo-Maltese-ness which has somehow managed to survive this experience. And of course, the point to make here is that there's no real parallel, it seems to me, in the Cypriot and Anglo-Cypriot relationship between 1939 and 1945, although Anastasia Yangu, who's with us today, is about to publish a thesis in book form on this, and can maybe correct me. But there's only very limited convergence, is the point, under wartime conditions in the Anglo-Cypriot relationship. The island fell between the cracks of the Second World War in the same way as it did in the First World War. It wasn't fought over, it didn't have its villages razed, of course, as Crete did. And of course in Crete too, there was a piece of legend was afterwards put upon it of a kind of Anglo-Cretan resistance with residues of the Anglo-Maltese kind. This isn't to discount of course, the wartime services of many Cypriots, the record of the Cyprus regiment, and much work is being done on the latter. Of course, Cypriot volunteers stranded alongside Palestinian Jews on the beaches of Kalamata when the Royal Navy failed to arrive in the spring of 1941. And indeed, of course, the Cyprus regiment, as we've said, in Italy. But I think, as Anastasia Yangu's book will point out, there remained a missing of mind between the British and the Greek Cypriots after 1939, which was to some extent put on hold, but it was not reversed. After 1945, matters could be picked up where they had left off before the war, and the struggle thereafter, of course, was crystallised and triangulated in a new phase of conflict between left, right, and the British colonial presence. Now, in trying to pin down again two distinguishing features of Anglo-Cypriot relationships, there are two factors one might say something about. One is the royal connection, or the lack of it, and the other one is about the role of the church and British relations with the church, which are so vital. As far as the theme of monarchy is concerned, I mean, from the mid-19th century, especially the 20th century, senior British royals often played a prominent, or indicated a prominent engagement with Mediterranean society, with Mediterranean places. They're constantly in and out of Malta. Edward VII, it was difficult to get him away from the Mediterranean because he was so frequently cruising on the royal yacht in that region, opening dockyards, unveiling statues to protagonists of the British connection, or whatever. And George VI's visit to Malta in 1943 was an iconic occasion for sport. Royal visits to Gibraltar played a key role in the gradual Anglicisation of a highly cosmopolitan civil population. And indeed, if you think Princess Diana's honeymoon voyage, and when was it, in 1980, it's a Mediterranean voyage. It begins in Gibraltar. That's why the Spanish King Juan Carlos didn't attend the wedding beforehand, because that was going to happen. And she ends up in Egypt. So there's a strong Mediterranean pattern to royal visitations. But of course, with Cyprus, always missed out. Between Richard the Lionheart, in whenever that was, 1180, whatever it is, and 1993, October, I don't think you will find a visit by a British monarch, or perhaps by a senior royal, certainly not by a reigning monarch. So that seems, maybe that says something. It's another little marker of the tangent at which Cyprus lay, even as a colony, to the phenomena of the British in the region. On the church matter, again, Maltese comparison is interesting because these are two essentially church-led, even more than the British government, church-led societies. On the one hand, Orthodoxy, on the other hand, Roman Catholicism, both intensely suspicious of an English Protestant presence. It's highly unlikely, isn't it, that any Cypriot archbishop could be actually born in Britain. Although, by comparison, Caruana, the Bishop of Malta, between 1915 and 1943, a long period, was actually born in Scotland, but certainly not a Scot. Nevertheless, if you had asked in the colonial office in London, end of 1930s, which church are you more worried about, the Maltese or the Cypriot? Which one you've got to keep your eye on? They would almost certainly accept the Maltese, if only because of its wider international and Vatican connections. But in the crisis of war, the cooperation of the Maltese clergy proved absolutely vital. Of course, after all, the Italians were bombing their churches, which was a rather, significant factor. Whereas in the case of Cyprus, of course, the stance of orthodoxy and above all of the local tenants, the Ondias, remained characteristically, perhaps the word is enigmatic. And after 1945, again, looked at comparatively, the British and the Maltese, the clergy in Malta, the church in Malta, united in a common suspicion of the left. Whereas in Cyprus, of course, what happens, for all sorts of reasons, is that the church in the end goes on an offensive against both the left and the British, with the risks, the higher level of risks entailed in that, partly perhaps because the British wouldn't accept the right even more than they would not accept the left as a partner in the island. But the dynamics of the two islands at that point begin to diverge significantly, and not least in relation to the church. And so risks, I think, are something, the concept of risks seems to me to be coming to my paper here, because if I think about the world of the late 1940s and the early 1950s, it's a world where the opportunity seemed there to be grasped by many people. If only you step out in front. If only you do take the risks involved in laying hold of whatever it is you want. It's a moment to grab opportunities, and particularly those who were in any sense opposed by the seemingly favoured British. The problem being, of course, that if the British were sometimes earlier been weaker than they might appear, later on they perhaps weren't so vulnerable as people thought them to be. And the consequences of exploiting or seeking to exploit their vulnerability might well be booby-trapped with unintended effects in all sorts of ways. And there, one comparison might be not Maltese but Gibraltarian, because after all, both Spain and Greece, and in terms of the Greek Cypriot problem, share an irredentist dimension to their politics. Both are connected with a nearby motherland. In Gibraltar, the motherland is very near. You can walk from the government house of Spain in about 25 minutes. Now, no Spanish government had ever tried to activate a claim to the rock since the 1780s. They were usually, the Spanish government, far more interested in getting bits of Morocco with British help than laying a practical claim to Gibraltar. But nevertheless, the fact was, in psychological and moral terms, Gibraltar remained a dagger in the side of Spain, to use the normal quotation, the normal tag attached to this. But after 1953, circa 1953-54, triggered in fact by a visit by the Queen herself to Gibraltar, Franco reversed his policy. He began a policy of pressurising the border. Of course, this culminated in the closure of the border, siege of 1969. And the result of that, of course, has been that Gibraltarians ended up by shedding the very real degree of Spanish identity they retained, and became fervently more British than ever, and indeed more British than the British, of course, actually want them to be. And that remains the case today. Yesterday was Gibraltar's National Day. The place would have been awash with Union Jacks and Gibraltar flags. There wouldn't have been a Spanish flag in sight. How different that would have been 40 years ago. 40 years ago, when the leading newspapers in Gibraltar were Spanish language papers, today there's only one paper in Gibraltar, Gibraltar Chronicle. It's the oldest English language newspaper in the world. So, the world of 1950, where people took risks, but unfortunately, of course, the risks often blew up in one's face. And this isn't to say that anybody was stupid or to be reviled for their errors, but only that it was a world full of pitfalls, full of traps, which one was apt to blunder into regardless. And of course, the British made their own errors, made their own mistakes, and not least in terms of strategy in the near and so-called Middle East. And so to move on to that aspect for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, of course one variable of that period is the higher premium attached to the friendship of Greece, attached to Greece over Turkey in the diplomatic politics of the region. And of course this was very important in terms of the calculations that led to the militancy of the Yoka campaign in Cyprus, to maximise the opportunity of a single leverage over Britain, not least in the United Nations. And of course this logic wasn't without foundation. Britain had no intention, of course, of fighting for Greece before 1939, but she did so, and often regretted, however, what happened in 1941. And so you have a legend of Anglo-Greek camaraderie that nevertheless took shape in the post-war period. Turkey, by contrast, was very much in the doghouse in the immediate wake of the war for having remained neutral for so long. After the war too, Greece seemingly urgently and deserved being saved in a way far more acutely than Turkey, and had to work her passage back into Western, so-called Western favour. That was why she was such a tame pet, if you like, over the whole process of handing the Dodecanese back to Greece. Greek entry, of course, into NATO in 1952, and as Evanthis Atsifosilio argues, provided at last a reliable guarantee of Greece's northern borders that was always a vital consideration. So there are all kinds of reasons for thinking at that time that the old Venizelos principle that you couldn't possibly break with the framework of Anglo-Greek friendship, good reasons for thinking that no longer held. Ironically, however, it was exactly this period, early mid-1950s, when Turkish primacy over Greece in the kind of Western regional matrix, certainly in British calculations and American calculations, were reverting to pre-war norms. Egypt was slipping from the British grasp, and one needed help from Iraq and Syria to help keep her in line. Turkey offered to do the job. The Americans needed the Turkish army in Korea. And in reality, the NATO door was only opened, to use that old metaphor in Cypriot term, to Greece, because it was already opening to Turkey. Otherwise, it would probably have been shut. And the British were most unenthusiastic about that NATO exercise in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was British insistence that if it did go forward, it went forward without Cyprus. After 1954, Western security arrangements, Northern Tier, Centre, and all that in the region were really dressed up versions of Turkish plans that they have been pressing for some years. The point, therefore, is that the strategy of militant emesis, based on exploiting a highly fissile strategic and diplomatic situation, had certain fundamental errors built into it in terms of the realities of the period. The risks seem to be worth taking, because in making geopolitical investments, as recent history proves, taking risks in politics and diplomacy is even more dangerous than in stocks and shares. So, well, let me end on the Cypriot relationship. Of course, it was deformed by the end of empire in ways that I've avoided talking about in this paper. But one anecdote perhaps sums up just how ambivalent it was. In the late 1950s, the Colonial Office retained a chef de protocole, a man called Colonel Hefford, who became very adept at the flummery of Independence Day celebrations. He went around the empire arranging these sorts of occasions. Because the whole purpose was to shroud the event in sentiment and goodwill. These services were normally warmly accepted. The Greek Cypriots would have absolutely nothing to do with it. And as Sir David Cannadine, in a recent book on Independence Day ceremonies, points out that August the 16th, 1960 in Nicosia, there were no speeches, no sentimental songs, and there was no royal presence. So very different. And indeed, if you cast your mind back to the British withdrawal from the Ionian Islands in 1864, one Greek observer, with the Hellenic tongue no doubt very much in cheek, commented that nothing became the British in the protectorate like their leaving of it. That's not something you could ever say, of course, about Cyprus. And it's that opaqueness, that obliqueness, that awkwardness, that distancing of August 1960, which is so much in keeping, it seems to me, with the very nature of the British presence, colonial presence, ruling presence in the island since 1878, and explains why the relationship is, in many ways, the slightly damaged thing it has been. So let me end there and invite questions. Thank you.